We are really happy to do another of these webinars and delighted that many of you are joining us multiple times. We're planning to do 4 this year with partners from around the world. And today we are privileged to have Rajiv Goyal join us. Rajiv is the founder and the board chair of KTK-BELT, a Rainforest Trust partner in Nepal. Originally from Long Island, after graduating from Brown, he went to Nepal first as a Peace Corps volunteer in 2001, and then returned to law school at NYU and a master's at Cornell, where he developed the concept of the vertical university he'll tell us about. He's also worked for the UN High Commission for Human Rights and his family's foundation, the Cloud Forest Fund. His book, The Spring of Namje, won the Paul D. Cohen Award for Nonfiction. And today, Rajiv is going to tell us about conservation in Nepal and about the 7 KTK-BELT projects generously funded by Rainforest Trust's donors since 2016. So super excited to have you join us, Rajiv. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you, Rainforest Trust, for having me here today. I'm just delighted. So I begin today by telling you about a little bit about my own story and also the story of KTK-BELT. We call it KTK-BELT for short because it has a very long name, Koshitapu Kanchanjunga Biodiversity Education Livelihood Terra Studio. And today our story is a very vertical one. If you're wondering what the vertical university is, you can look at this photo. This woman here, she would be a professor of the vertical university. Perhaps even the yak in the photo would be a professor. And this beautiful carpeted field full of wildflowers would be an open classroom of the vertical university. But where did it all start? The concept of the vertical university actually began in about 2013 in a village called Yangsila that not many people have heard of. I had been working for 10 years in Nepal, as James mentioned. I first went to Nepal as a Peace Corps volunteer in 2001. I was building schools and water projects and living across different villages in rural Nepal, trying to make some kind of difference. But it started to feel like development projects were actually the problem and leading to all kinds of, everywhere you saw fragmentation of the beautiful forest, you saw huge levels of deforestation, sand extraction, as roads were proliferating everywhere. And so in 2013, I went to Cornell University with a simple question in my pocket, which was, there are 20,000 government schools in the country. There's 7 million children in the education system. What is their role in protecting the biocultural heritage of the nation? And in the course of that study, I arrived in a village, Yangsila, that is depicted here, where surprisingly, whereas in so many parts of Nepal, we were seeing a lot of fragmentation and destruction, here in Yangsila, everything looked intact. And I became friends with a man named Kumar Vishwakarma, who was a local teacher who belongs to the so-called Dalit caste group, and had this dream of, how do I take my children out of the 4 walls of the classroom, out into the wetlands and the forests and the fields? And this was Kumar Sir's dream. So I literally just spent a year living in Yangsila with Kumar Sir and just talked to farmers, talked to the local traditional people that were in this community to understand what was their relationship to the forest and the fields, what was their viewpoint about everything that was around them. And I was just astonished by what I found, the incredible beauty in the people, and how for them every stone, every bamboo, everything in the landscape was something that they had all this rich kind of knowledge about, to the point where, for me, though I was coming from, at the time, Cornell University, and many of the people I was encountering maybe had never even stepped foot in a formal educational setting, for me, they were professors. They were the ones who were going to teach me about this landscape, about all of the species that were around them. And for them, every fern, every seed, everything had a different property, a medicinal property, or it was used for fodder or as a building material. And this knowledge system was not kind of combined, it was not concentrated in one person, nor was it in a book, but it was intergenerational. It was something that had been amassed over many, many generations and was kind of shared in a cloud through all of these deep interactions that people had with nature, to the point where you could talk to one person for an hour and they could tell you about 100 plants just standing in a single location. So from that came this kind of inspiration that, like, imagine if you went from the lowest point of Yangsala to the highest, just a 5-hour walk, from the plains to what are known as the Shivalik Hills. So from the Charko Shijari forest to Dumsepaka Hill, you would encounter over 500 plant species. You could learn about those species from 17 different ethnic groups that were found here who spoke different languages. So imagine if this was a new sort of paradigm of education, and we started to dream about the idea of linking this verticality and the heterogeneity of the landscape. This is where we really kind of start to think that this incredibly outsized biodiversity of Yangsala and this biodiversity bulge that was here was linked to this heterogeneity of the landscape and sort of the natural folds of the mountains that create all these different microclimates. But though to me, everything in Yangsala looked very intact, it was very, very threatened by land grabbing. So in that year that I told you about where I lived in Yangsala, people would show up in motorbikes or in Scorpios to ask about the cost of land. And I wondered, like, why would a farmer for whom land is the most sacred thing that they have in their life, why would they sell it to begin with? And that was one of the questions that I looked at in my research. And we found that, like, almost all the farmers were in debt. And I continue to believe that if you're going to work in any kind of conservation in South Asia or really in anywhere in Asia, it begins kind of with that, the situation of the farmer. What is driving that? So because they're in debt and, the lender is calling every day asking for his money, they put their land title in the bank to get a loan. And then they can't pay that back. And then what happens is the land speculators are basically take the land, right? Because they can't pay back the interest and the payments. Then they become landless. Then what happens? They have to go abroad and leave a country as fecund and endowed with natural resources as Nepal and go and basically work in like modern, almost slave-like conditions. And then when they return, many of them return back with poorer health and further indebted and now landless, right? So it was this vicious cycle. And so from that was born this idea of a three-pronged framework of conservation, education, livelihood, that you had to think about all three of these. So in a place like Nepal, what are you going to educate about if all of this myriad species, all of the fauna and flora are lost, right? With deforestation and the intrusion of monocultures. So it begins with protecting what's there. Then if you can't educate people about and sort of enhance and fortify the indigenous knowledge that's already there through the formal education system, then what chance is there at livelihood? And if there's no livelihoods, then obviously people are going to engage in, selling of pangolins or of illegal logging, right? So we thought about it through this three-pronged framework and trying to work at the pith of these three circles. And then out of that came this idea of the learning grounds, which I think is the real innovation of the KTK-BELT project and how KTK-BELT and Rainforest Trust came together in 2016. We had this idea of, well, before the land grabbers come in, if we could purchase sort of small parcels of area for a local entity that would be indigenous-led, also called the learning grounds. And if they could conserve what's there, like first identifying, are there gray hornbill, are there is there rosewood or golden monitor lizard? What's the species there? First, to understand what does it eat, what does it need in the landscape, and using the indigenous knowledge to protect it or conserve it. Then second, focusing on 6th to 8th graders, because that for us was this transitional age, when your attitudes about the environment are shaped. So then every Friday or Sunday, could we bring the children into the learning grounds from the, Kumar Sir's dream of breaking down those walls of the classroom? And then how do you kind of develop livelihoods in the learning grounds without turning it into a monoculture, which turns out to be the hardest of the three parts of the conservation education livelihood framework. And so all of these white spots here mark locations where we tried to set up very small learning grounds, just a few acres, that connected different, that were really strategically placed. So they were either at the entrance of like Sikti Community Forest, which is this huge forest in Yangsala, or they were out on a ridge top that was threatened by some kind of road intrusion that would have kind of harmed that ecosystem. And then we tried to connect all of these into a kind of trail that would become this dream of a kind of mini vertical university just in Yangsala, where you could walk for 5 hours and connecting learning grounds to learn about different species or different indigenous knowledge that was found in these different little points. And here you see in the most urban part of Yangsala was where actually we started. So there were some discarded containers, and our co-founder Priyanka Bistra, who's an architect and a design professor, she worked with the local youth and particularly with young builders and young female builders and even with poachers actually to like how to work with them to change the conversation about their views of biodiversity and these things. So this became like a open, we call it the container classroom. And it's a place where children come to learn about different modules, you know, the 6th to 8th graders in the learning grounds. Like, for example, here the kids are learning about water cycle. And then true to this idea of farmer as professor, we would have the elders come in and share. The woman on the top is talking about holy basil, and the kids are learning and then using video to document the knowledge so it's not lost with the new generation. So this becomes like sort of the curriculum or the library of the vertical university. And then in any university you have fellows. So we had a lot of people like Ganga Limbu, who is a youth of Yangsala. She's also our first Rainforest Trust fellow along with Mohan Pandey. And here she's working with the community to show the videos taken by the children, to share back the knowledge and to sort of recognize it. And so the success of Yangsala, which was a kind of like small little pilot experiment, we lived in Yangsala for 5 years in a place called House One, which is this little shamble house that we lived, and we were weaving this beautiful dream. I think some of the happiest years of our lives. We ended up interconnecting 917 acres, you know, comprised of private land that the farmers own, community forest, but a patchwork with small learning grounds connecting and making sure that the land grabbers couldn't get a foothold. And I think it was a kind of, it had a marrow of success to show that the learning grounds could actually have these small little learning grounds could have some kind of power against forces, you know, like land grabbing. And we ended up, I think, preventing the local extirpation of, you know, Manis pentadactyla, which is Chinese pangolin. There are 2 critically endangered species, all pangolin species that are critically endangered. There are 2 that are found in Nepal, the Indian and the Chinese pangolin, and both are found here. But through awareness, through the learning grounds, through the education, the kids would go home and say, no, that, you know, the pangolin is not something to eat. And the elders would also say, of course not, that's in our belief system as well. It provides all kinds of benefits to the land that we already know about. So it's about fortifying these belief systems. And we work with people like Binod Puri, who's pictured here, to develop the livelihood strategy. We created these biointensive farms. So we espoused we call it like the Pareto principle, like 80-20 model in the learning grounds, keeping 80% sort of a bit more deep wild and then 20% under kind of semi-wild with some cultivation, which also tends to be good for wildlife because of edge effects and things like that. And this, you know, very simple, just having farmers come into the learning grounds, gain some employment or take back seeds or bring seeds in, you would be surprised how powerful that very simple idea is. So we started with this dream of the lowest to highest point to Yangsala, and then we started to dream bigger, and, you know, dreams begot dreams. And we thought, what if we went from Koshitapu all the way to Kanchenjunga, the KTK of the KTK-BELT, and imagine if you could connect it with different learning grounds and weave this biocultural corridor. You would have 6,700 flowering plants, right? You'd have over 200 mammal species, over 800 bird species found along this corridor. So going from, you know, Bengal florican all the way up to pangolins, to red panda, all the way to snow leopard, essentially. And you could have a totem pole of life. So this kind of became our dream of the vertical university. So to weave it, we just kind of went up the mountain. So as we went north of Yangsala, we encountered this extraordinary region that was introduced to us by Uday Lo, who ended up becoming the Learning Grounds director of the community there. And it's a place that actually houses 28 of 31 nationally found rhododendron species. And tree rhododendron is also the national flower of the country. So this place was also a symbol of biodiversity and a celebration of the national, Nepalese identity as well. So you can see that it was this place of extraordinary. Most people don't think of rhododendrons as large trees, but these are actually these very endemic rhododendron trees of the TMJ. But this place was also threatened by road building, where there were roads. Though we think of roads as, roads can be very positive to engage, to provide transport. What was happening in this part of Nepal is existing roads are being widened, or unnecessary side roads are being built, or small roads that are sufficient are being developed into much larger highways and conduits to logging, bringing in all kinds of pollution. And so this is was the trend in the rhododendron region, which had these incredibly sacred groves of, you could almost feel the spirit of these rhododendron trees, an area incredibly rich in fungi, also home to the red panda, and also to the dhole, the Asiatic wild dog. And so what did we do with the support of Rainforest Trust? We went back to our bread and butter of the learning grounds. So this is actually the TMJ learning grounds. So we secured this land to prevent it from being grabbed, and tried to create a space that would inspire people to think about this landscape in a different way, to think about the possibilities that go beyond just sort of destroying it, but also highlighting all of the critical value and knowledge and information of the local people through the learning grounds. So we were supported by Rainforest Trust. Felicia Spector from Rainforest Trust came to visit us. And as James mentioned, we have had this extraordinary relationship now for 7 years as we were trying to weave this vertical university. So as we went further north, where you see the red arrow pointing to that yellow highlighted area, we encountered a very interesting area. It was a quote unquote, you could say unprotected. In other words, it wasn't under a protected area status. It's between the 3rd and 5th tallest peaks in the world. And on the Tibet side, there was another large protected area that had snow leopards wandering all through this landscape. So as we arrived in what is known as the Lumba Samba, we encountered this incredibly rich sort of landscape that, was full of these incredible gorges and valleys and peatlands and high altitude glaciers and wetlands, full of these, incredible lakes, and home to, the snow leopard that would move from Kanchenjunga to Makalu or back, or, it would go through this area. And so what we discovered here was just like in Yangsla, though maybe if you square it, the amount of indigenous knowledge was so incredibly rich, and it was related to the remoteness of the people living. They weren't living, near the cities. They were 3 days away. Their life was completely off the grid. And, here we began to see that they were the original stewards of this landscape, that to come in and, try to impose anything on them didn't make any sense, that they were the first inhabitants, and it was their indigenous values that in fact had protected it and kept it roadless as it was. And here, everything about the local way of life was about the yak. And though the region looks uninhabited, people actually inhabit every part of this landscape, and they know all the movements of all the snow leopards and where the red panda are, and they live in a cadence with the fauna and flora around them. That was just, for me, incredibly beautiful to see in these highlands. And many have multiple homes, and they have these makeshift homes, and they move with their yaks, because the yaks never really stay in one place because of the temperature variation through the season. So they move on their own, and then the master sort of moves with them. And so here, we met Chiring, who was also joined us as a youth fellow, and then started to work with Ganga and how do we document the local knowledge. And Chiring is just, I don't think he has much formal education, but he probably knows more than anybody who has a PhD in yaks. There's 150 yaks even his daughter in the background, she's like 10 years old. She probably knows more than anybody, who studied this, tried to, read about yaks in a book. And so again, this idea of the indigenous knowledge and the farmer as professor, the herder as professor was reinforced. But this region, and part of why I felt a lot of melancholy being up here, this region was under threat from the imposition, because of these deep gorges from potential hydropower. So we worked to try to declare this region as a roadless region. And the way that we did it was we had conversations. So Kamala Rai was a social mobilizer. She said, look, if roads proliferate all the Himalayas, then where are people going to go trekking, right? And so in the future, those places that are as yet roadless are going to be even more valuable. So through, again, for me, everything starts with a conversation, with talking to the community. We then were able to, using Bhutan and Nepal as an example, just a very simple statistic here, a lot of numbers, but Bhutan has 1/5 as many tourists as Nepal, but generates more tourism revenue because it is a high value, low footprint model. So we tried to argue this, that maybe in Nepal, we should focus on is better for wildlife, it's better for communities and cultures. And then if you can see in the map, there are these green corridors. So just like the Lumba Samba, we were arguing, that Bhutan is actually connected all the different protected areas so wildlife can also migrate. So we used that example, and it was very convincing with the local people. And our big achievement, I think our crowning achievement was, after 5 years of hard work, many of the legislators, the indigenous legislators, created a self-governed, autonomous indigenous biocultural heritage special conservation zone and ecotourism area that was registered at the local rural municipality level, and is self-administered. So this was kind of a new kind of thing that we'd opened for possibility of conservation in the country. As we look a little bit to the right, then there was this other piece called Papung. And here, I'm just going to show a few seconds of a video that shows, this was a lake with an area with 12 large lakes and over 200 seasonal wetlands that was highly, highly threatened by, again, roads and other infrastructure projects that were trying to come in. And so here as well, we worked with the local indigenous leaders, the first inhabitants, who are the Dhokpia people, who are the original stewards of this land. And you can just see from the photos, I think, the beauty of this landscape. We worked with the Rainforest Trust to prevent the intrusion of, I think it was 9 planned hydropower projects in this area, which is 86,000 acres adjacent to the Lumba Samba. There was a waterfall called Pung Punge because of the water, when it falls, it's a pung pung sound. The word Jarna means waterfall in Nepali. So these incredible, the same factors that made it so beautiful also made it like very much imperiled and very much in danger. And so again, using the same concept and with indigenous leaders, Pasang Dai was the leader of the Indigenous Federation of Nepal, and he is from that community. We were able to declare this as a roadless area as well. And so now just dropping down to the plains, and I'll be done in about 2 more minutes. And thank you for listening to me. So dropping all the way down, we get to where all of that water from Papung flows to complete the vertical university down in Koshitapu wetlands. This is a wildlife reserve that has a core area. It's surrounded by a buffer zone that's very densely populated with about 80,000 people. Again, indigenous traditional communities that live in harmony with this place. But the story was very much about conflict. From you have a buffer zone and then you have a wildlife reserve, and sort of a lot of issues with human wildlife disharmony. And so the story of Koshitapu is declared because of the Arna, the wild water buffalo. There's only 2,500 mature adults left in the whole world. It's the primogenitor of the modern buffalo. But it was one of the conservation success stories of Nepal. It had dwindled to the 100s about 30 years ago, and now it's over 500. But it is a birder's paradise. Species like the Bengal florican breed here. Probably the last hope for the survival of the Bengal florican is in parts of Cambodia and here, and Koshitapu, where it breeds, might be one of the most important habitats. That's part of our current project with the Rainforest Trust. Bears poacher, the lesser adjutant, which is in Nepali is called Hazur Bachara, which means the grandfather bird, I think for obvious reasons. The yellow-breasted bunting, which people might know it as the rice bird. It does a migration from Nepal to Siberia, and then on the way in parts of China, it's eaten as a delicacy, and its survival it went from least concern to critical, like almost overnight. And it is in Koshitapu. Also, we have a population of Gangetic dolphins, the elongated turtle, one of my favorite species. Anyway, and so we use this learning grounds model to protect we establish some learning grounds to change that conversation of conflict into a peace and harmony between the core area and the buffer zone, and working with the fisher folk, turning a problem into a solution, having local people remove the invasive species of the jalkumbi here, water hyacinth, and to then work with local women to make products that are being made through the Koshitapu learning grounds. So this is our dream project that we're still building. And I'll just finish with, you might be wondering, like, so how is this, just 1 minute of a few more slides to show you, how is this dream being woven? So I'm today speaking on behalf of all of these 7 entities in Nepal. This whole project was completely a team effort. So you have the Vertical Biodiversity Fund, and then we have 6 learning grounds entities. Donors, mainly our anchor donor has been Rainforest Trust, like every year, and then to KTK-BELT US, and then goes to Nepal. And now slowly, by 2025, this is what we hope will remain. And so with that, I just want to thank the Rainforest Trust. I want to thank you, James, and Leslie, Jackie, Whitney, the entire team, Felicia, Steve, all of the wonderful people at Rainforest Trust for the really special support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. Really a pleasure, and such extraordinary photographs and videos and stories. I'll only ask a few questions because people are already starting to ask questions in the Q&A section, and please, everyone, welcome to do that. Let me ask about the conservation side. Achieving long-term conservation of especially wildlife species through community engagement and education is challenging anywhere in the world. How much information do you have about how the endangered and critically endangered and vulnerable species in this extraordinary landscape, how they're doing? And do you think that from the animals' perspective that this approach is working?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question, James. So if you noticed in my presentation, in the kind of upper belt, like as we move from Yangsala north, what we encountered was these places that were still kind of as of yet roadless, right? So if you compare that baseline against a scenario where roads would come through, and we often call them like roads to nowhere, because there are other roads, but they often end up becoming conduits to bring in, usually it's hydropower projects that can be very destructive, can break the connectivity, that very vital connectivity, and disrupt the food systems of species. So when you compare those two futures, I would say, right, then I think that the value to those species, and that, it's about 380,000 acres that's roadless. And again, this wasn't like an imposition, like it was a recognition by local people that there's going to be economic value later in terms of trekking and tourism, which Nepal is known for if they stay roadless, right? So because of that, I feel like the outcomes for snow leopards and other migratory species like musk deer, I think have been, Himalayan bear, have been very strong. And also the idea of the learning grounds, I think, helps take pressure off of, by having kind of more biointensive farming, you can take pressure off of some of the wild places, through the kind of indigenous methods. I think in Koshitapu, we're having a lot of like direct species impact, because they're Like people are throwing stones at the mugger crocodile or at the dolphins from the Koshi Barrage Bridge. And just like through changing consciousness. And for me, it's like if you change the attitudes of people and they realize, oh my God, there's only 17 freshwater dolphins in this entire river, then you kind of have that outcome. You might end up saving the species through awareness, through signage. Also with Koshitapu is kind of overrun with feral cattle, and it's causing a lot of disturbances with other species. So there's things that we're doing also with our partner, National Trust for Nature Conservation, NTNC, which is a pseudo-government NGO in Nepal, and the learning grounds where we're going to have, I think, some species impact. As I mentioned in Yangsla, with the pangolins, I think we had a direct impact because they were going to, that was being like eaten to death. It wasn't even the trade of the scales. It was like people were eating it as bushmeat. And I think all the movie nights and all of the events, I think really shifted. We did this thing called Scrappy News, where children gave like news about pangolins, and it was seen by millions of people in the subcontinent. So things like that can actually have create a lot of excitement around children and youth. And that has like a huge power for conservation. Maybe we don't have the statistics and numbers, but I think like there's definitely, that for me is the dial, like how you change the conservation outcomes, I think. Mm-hmm.
Super. We've got a lot of interesting questions, so let me turn to some of those. The flip side of my question about how the animals are doing is posed by Eric Veach, who asks how successful have you been at improving human livelihoods, and how many people have you impacted, and what do they do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of like so the way we measure the human impact is like for many of the indigenous and traditional communities that are adjacent to the learning grounds, they have other non-monetary ways that they interact and have exchange through barter markets is a big part of like the low Himalayas to the high Himalayas and exchanging of goods, like things you might see in like the Andes, in communities there. So the fortification of those traditional markets and relationships, I think, is one way. Another kind of way that I think through this, the biointensive farming part, Nepal is, they call it Kirsi Pradhan Desh, which means like a country whose whole economy is rooted in agriculture. But there's been like a huge kind of use of chemicals and, things like that. And so by having this biointensive organic farming, that is really kind of caught on. Also, just simple things like teaching local farmers in the learning grounds about cutting and grafting and balancing the cultivation with what are the trees that we're losing, like the Indian rosewoods and others, and having them, we have a system where they plant fruit and nut trees for their own retirement, in a way. And you'd be surprised, a nut tree can cover someone's retirement in Nepal. And then they also plant other kind of species that have been lost as well. So I think it's been through agriculture, through education, and then also I think somebody like Ganga, who, she had a really hard upbringing, lost her mother when she was young, and now has lost her father. And just see, as a woman, being well, I can learn technology, I can document indigenous knowledge, I can be a conservationist. You don't just have to be a man and in the highest level of government or whatever. I can be in the village and doing things. So I think it's I always say, aspiration creates inspiration. So I think the people from the lower belt are inspiring those connections to each other, is also building a lot of upstream, downstream, just resilience to the relationships as well.
Well, Donna Franklin has two questions. The first is, what role do women play in leadership and decision making?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So going into that, so we have actually a co-founder, co-director model. So me and Priyanka were we kind of rejected the idea of, there's a kind of very hegemonic kind of, hierarchy and patriarchy, and unfortunately in conservation as well, one must say it. And so we were trying to challenge that with a co-director model, which I encourage other groups to also think about, where you have a male, female, or you have some diversity kind of balanced. And so all of the learning grounds are kind of on that co-director model. And we have like in the learning grounds boards, we have underrepresented Indigenous women. And as I mentioned, a lot of the upper belt communities are actually like a little bit more matriarchal. So you see in the Sherpa, Dokpia, Bote communities, you see like a lot of the legislators and the Indigenous lawmakers are actually female. And so they were the ones who created the Lumba Samba. And so those are the things I would say. And in the Tarai, like in Koshitapu, there's Amrita Sardar. She's a local community. She belongs to a disadvantaged community. And she was kind of mentored by Ganga, and she's now documenting the biodiversity in her community. She's on the board of the Learning Grounds. She's on the board of the Vertical Biodiversity Fund. So we have like landless women who are in the boards of like some of the major organizations that we've created in Nepal that also have their own land holdings as well. So I think that's been really strong, and that's kind of what we're trying to gently, I think, challenge, and it doesn't happen overnight though.
Donna also wonders whether there are any educational tours to the areas where the Vertical University has learning grounds.
Yes, so we are trying to work on what we call like a vertical journey. So we're trying to we actually don't we don't generally use the word tourism in the like philosophy project. We use like biocultural heritage visitation. That's what we're calling it. And we want people to actually come and like actually like go to the Vertical University. So you can learn from go on walks in the forest and learn about plants and eat from the communities and the learning grounds. So we're actually working on that a bit with Rainforest Trust, and a group called Conservation Capital has also been like working with us. So we're designing that with Neil and Amy, and we're having like great conversations trying to figure that out. So it's not yet been formalized, but we're going to be launching a website called verticaluniversity.org, which is also supported by Rainforest Trust. And it's going to be where we're going to have our Indigenous knowledge, like videos. And then within that, we're going to have the vertical journey, like where you can get in touch. And it's going to be a kind of income generating model to sustain the program. But we're still trying to figure out a way to do that without causing too much disruption, because it's very hard to, as our studies have shown, is like it's a whole other beast. So yeah, so we're slowly getting there on that, I would say. Yeah, but if people want to visit, they should get in touch with me, and I'd love to help you visit if you want.
And we'd be happy to pass on contact details.
Sure.
Of course. So Cynthia Starr asks, how do you decide on and establish the boundaries for the learning centers and the protected areas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, like what KTK-BELT is doing differently is we're working at the rural. So I should step back. In 2008, Nepal kind of changed its entire government structure and moved from a centralized kind of monarchy structure, 2007-8, to federalism. So, and it created three co-equal governments. So you have the local rural municipalities, as they're called, and then you have provinces, and then you have the federal government. But in the spirit of the Constitution, they're all actually co-equal. And most people don't know that local rural municipalities can actually declare and create their own special conservation areas. It's there in the kind of new structure. So we've been working with constitutional lawyers to kind of define those areas. And so the boundaries are often the rural municipality boundary, to answer the question, or those are broken down into wards. So where the ward legislature kind of, not legislature, but the representative of the ward votes, then that's how we've been creating the boundaries. And the roadless, the 380,000 acre roadless area I mentioned, that was all created by is being created by local governments, because we're still trying to support the lower stretches of that. And for the learning grounds, that was a more, I would say, whimsical process, in the sense of like, a lot of it, again, was like spending a lot of time with the local community leaders, and to understand like so much of the land has stories. And then when you understand certain land is threatened, there's obviously an impulse to keep it in the community and keep it intact. So it's based on a lot of the efforts of the local learning grounds directors like Kumar Sir, Yakadai, Majididi, all these different leaders that we have in the community, who then, kind of identified their kind of sacred land and was kind of done that way over time. Yeah.
Cool. Two of our guests, Michael Kachi, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name, and Leslie Marshall, both are curious about whether climate change is affecting what you do.
Yes, absolutely. And you can even think of the vertical university as a kind of climate escalator, which is why wherever there are mountains, I think it's like 40% of the world's surface is covered by mountains. This approach could be useful because species are migrating up the hill, right? And also it's affecting, agriculture systems where the tree line is changing and all of these things. So part of what the belt idea does, though, I should emphasize, like the learning grounds are like little tiny kind of, I call them like lily pads, and then you have like other community forest or even private homesteads or protected areas along the way. And the idea is to connect them to facilitate that movement, which species use that naturally, right? You see, that's why you see so much biodiversity on slopes, and because they regulate in this era of not just climate change, but change. I would say it's climate change, and it's also the land use change. That's the most, like, I have a friend, Don Whedon, who visited us and came in like to the project in 2018, and he'd lived in Nepal many years ago, like when in his younger days, and he was just amazed when we were flying by helicopter at like all the new roads, and he was like kind of sad, to see that. So you're seeing a lot of land use change with the north-south corridors, because you have to understand Nepal is between China and India, right? The two most populous countries in the world, just landlocked between these two countries. So that's why we believe the learning grounds, even though it's small, it might even be an acre or half an acre, but it can inspire. It's the same land, right? It's the same soil. So you can actually inspire a community to think about land use differently from the choices in that learning grounds. So that's like kind of our theory of change in the project. I don't know if I answered the question. I sort of
well, you didn't. You answered why the project is so important to enable plants and animals to adapt to climate change. You didn't directly answer whether climate change is having a negative impact yet in the landscape.
So there's the Himalayas are very young mountains, and they're just full of constant disaster impacts, and they're differential. So in the Koshi, you'll see flooding. In the high Himalaya, you'll see glacial lake outburst floods. In the middle range, what they call the Mahabharat hills of the middle belt of the Himalayas, all the springs are dying or weaning. So there's differential impacts of climate change, and the learning grounds are also like ways to understand how to confront climate and other change. But there's a huge impact of if you look up at the Himalayas, you don't see the white anymore the way you did in old photos, and so there's like drastic change happening. There is
but that must be affecting your hydrology. It must be affecting when the streams run.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so that's also kind of changing, and the streams are also like because what's happening is I still attribute a lot more of the change to the roads and the land use change than to climate change, is what I'm trying to say. Because in places you'll see when it rains, the water is just running down on the paved roads rather than so.
I mean, that's not unusual, especially in the tropics and subtropics, that while climate change is the threat of the future, it's currently not the number one threat in most places. The exceptions being some places in the Arctic. Interesting. Eric Veach came back with a question about what are your plans after 2025. Eric lives in Seattle and is tremendously polite. So I'm from New York like you, and so I'll be a little more abrupt and say 2025 is not very far away, and a lot of community conservation projects, including marine community projects, have sort of hoped that they could make themselves obsolete. And of course, a lot of people have found that without continued input of some finance and some guidance and some technical assistance, the chance of it all hanging together and going well over the long term isn't that great. So are you really going to disappear in 3 years or whatever it is? 2 years?
Yeah, actually, you know, I'm speaking to all of you from Pittsburgh, and I think it's a very positive thing for the project because Priyanka and I are both like kind of playing the board role and helping with design and other higher level. I wouldn't say higher level, but just different parts of the project. But it's been a huge challenge because now you're seeing the learning grounds like, oh no, we got to like fend for ourselves. And, you know, there's so much compliance in these countries. Most people don't think about that. Like you have to keep up all of your compliance, your government relations, you have to, all of that. The financial part is there, obviously, but there's other things too. And then, you know, founders after a while can actually become a little bit of a negative in a project, in my view, like because you can kind of become, you know, so, but what we're seeing is that the learning grounds through, as I mentioned, their relationships to each other, there's like a net, there's continuity. We have an indigenous country director, Pramod Lingden, who he's from Eastern Nepal. He's a CPA, he's a lawyer, he's doing his PhD. He's this amazing man. He's only 35 years old. So I think it's important. Like I'm actually originally from India. I'm not from Nepal. So I think it's very important that the Nepalis on the ground now like lead the vertical university. So in terms of the hardest part is going to be the fiscal sustainability. So how does that happen? And for that, like actually, not all learning grounds are created equal. So we created these 6 organizations and then the Vertical Biodiversity Fund. But we're finding that a few of the learning grounds are becoming like superstars. So in Kurule, the 3rd node, they have actually like now through their nursery, their plant nursery, they've produced like 100,000 grafted, you know, fruit and nut trees and also those wild trees. If they sell them all, they would earn like upwards of $50,000 or more, like US, right? So they're starting to show a capacity for self-sustainability while they manage the hydrology and protect the pangolins and everything, you know? So they're a model. And then we have other learning grounds that aren't doing as well, to be very honest, like go and visit and, you know, be like, get your act together, you know, because it's only 3 years left. So we're using the urgency language. But after 2025, I don't think we're done in Nepal. And we actually feel like there are other roadless biocultural heritage landscapes that we could probably work on and support kind of policy things. Like how do you have like, could we bring the learning grounds into the policy, like one village, one learning grounds, right? Like we have certain ideas like that. Could there be another type of vertical experiment in Nepal or in the Himalayas in Bhutan? Or so I think that's the future of, if you think about like a huge portion of humanity and a lot of species are in this like, you know, Northeast, you know, going into Assam and Darjeeling and Bhutan. So I think there's a lot more to do, but how will the learning grounds survive and how will they self-sustain? It's not going to be easy, but I think it's going to be, it remains to be seen, actually, to be honest, what happens. Yeah, but the protected areas that are being created, I think those are going to definitely thrive once the economic models kick in of the high value, low footprint. And I think it's going to succeed.
Great. A few other questions, and one from me. While you've been working at what is in fact a model of indigenous conservation, indigenous empowerment, indigenous traditional livelihoods and traditional cultures, the conservation community more widely and the political community more widely has begun to recognize the critical role that indigenous people will have to play all around the world in conservation. Are you, or even better, the indigenous leaders who you have been assisting, engaged with that conversation or with any of those networks? I can imagine that that is potentially a source of funding. It's potentially a source of wisdom and camaraderie. It's potentially a source of political leverage and policy.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, there are very powerful networks of Indigenous people working at the intersection of human rights, conservation, a lot of place-based issues, a lot of particular cases and legal cases. And so those networks exist all over Asia, and we've plugged into with certain groups, like in Borneo, there's a group. There's another group in Cambodia that we've connected to, where you have Indigenous people working on Bengal florican protection. So far, it's been me traveling and visiting these sister opportunities, but we've been trying to bring like Pasang and Karma and all of the local leaders in touch with other Indigenous, land defenders. For example, you have in Peru, we're doing the vertical university. There's actually a project called the Pluriversity, where they're trying to do some of the same idea, actually, promoting Summa Kausai, I believe it's called, like Buen Vivir, through like a learning grounds approach, actually. So we've connected those two experiments together. In a personal capacity, over the last year and a half, I was working with my mom and dad. We set up a little foundation precisely for supporting Indigenous land defenders in mountains, because I think a lot of these fights are like happening now, and a lot of the tipping points are going to be reached once you have land that's lost. And I think you can't bring it back. So we've been giving very small grants to Indigenous communities trying to protect biocultural heritage territorialities. So that's what I've been working on personally, but it's a great question about
Well, I mean, maybe we can help, because over the last year or so, we've been putting a lot of time and effort into developing relationships with various umbrella groups who work with Indigenous people around the world. And we've developed partnerships with several.
Yeah.
And the different ones have strengths and weaknesses. Some of them are primarily funders. Some of them are networks for capacity development, some of them for policy. So we could certainly introduce you to some of those, and you could potentially introduce some of them to some of the Indigenous leaders and groups that you work with. It might not be of value, but it might be of value.
No, I think that those kinds of connections and networks create confidence, because a lot of Indigenous groups are struggling, and they're at an innate disadvantage by being not represented in the court system, in the political architecture. So that kind of support and international networks, because Nepal is party to all of the international covenants for UNDRIP and ILO 169, and so it's all, the framework is all there.
Is KTK-BELT's ambition to protect land more or less complete? Have you completed the corridor that you wanted to complete, or do you have any ambitions to continue, or do we follow you as you move to a completely different setting?
Well, I think we got the latest, the biodiversity ARC project, I think as it's called, was a kind of capstone grant where we worked with the Asia program office within Rainforest Trust over the last year and a half, and we sort of asked the question, like, what's left? Like, how do we interconnect this belt and create it as a ICCA or territory of life, or give it some other kind of unique designation as a new model? So we designed that project, and we feel like that funding will be sufficient, for actually culminating the KTK-BELT. But I'll be a little bit cryptic. We've been scoping out another project for almost 2 years now, and we might be picking up the phone to call you guys about some other kind of opportunities like the ones where similar legislative tools were developed for the roadless area. So I think actually, I mentioned my little community foundation. I actually traveled to all through this period, like over a dozen countries, which I'd never done. I've been in Nepal for 20 years, a bit in China. And when I saw the Amazon as well. When I came back to Nepal, I in my head, everything I was comparing to Nepal. And I think the biodiversity value of what's in Nepal is still very rich. I think there's, like, as we were thinking about that, like, so what happens to KTK-BELT? Like, now the learning grounds are all grown up and they're getting out of the nest, and are we needed? And I think there's a lot more that we can do in the Himalayas. And there's so much institutional knowledge that even in Nepal, even in Eastern Nepal, there's still so much to do. So I think KTK-BELT is going to kind of keep its identity focused on Nepal and trying to be like a really good organization in the country and doing like real work.
And maybe one final question, we're almost out of time, but what lessons have you learned that those of us working in other parts of the world, conservation supporters, conservationists, might benefit from? What's your parting lesson to us?
I think that we're undergoing like a poly crisis of biodiversity loss, pandemics, wars, and for the answers, I think we have to look to Indigenous people and their values and concepts of reciprocity, solidarity, intergenerational justice, and we must like fortify the what I call like the biocultural heritage, and just through fortifying and recognizing the biocultural heritage of people who live in the land, in the forest, I think they're going to do a much better job of conservation than anyone else, really. And they're the ones who have been the stewards. So that's one. And then my last point is just, I think that I think a lot is going to go down in the next 10 years. So it's very important to like get going and get the support to some of the groups that need it, even if everything is not perfect in the selection process. I think through trust, and if it's there, I would move and mobilize. That's my parting message.
Thank you so much, and thank you for allowing all of us to attend the Vertical University for 1 hour. It's been a great privilege, and it's a privilege of all of us to partner with you. And we can't wait to see where this journey takes you next. And to everybody who's joined us over the last hour, thank you for taking an hour of your time to spend with Rajiv. And to those of you who have supported this and other projects, thank you as ever. None of this happens without your tremendous support. Wishing everyone a successful winter, and hope to see all of you at our next webinar. Bye for now.
Great. Thank you, James. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.